Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the library. It is, as always, wonderful to see so many people come out for both the intellectual stimulation as well as the physical nourishment, both being provided to us by Vanderbilt University. We are so delighted they are here. I'm Bruce Farrar. I'm the Branch Services Administrator for the Public Library, and on behalf of the Metropolitan Government, Mayor Bill Purcell, the members of the Council, we welcome you to the library. Also, on behalf of our Library Director, Donna Nicely, and the members of the Library Board, we are delighted that you are here. This is going to be a stimulating, as always, session. I am looking forward to it. We have a professor of English who is going to speak to us on why presidentialism is bad for U.S. democracy. Now, I want you to understand that the library is a completely neutral and nonpartisan thing. Nothing that I should say should be taken one way or the other. I can't speak for Vanderbilt, but I could think of no better way to get this started than a few quotes from our current president, who has a unique way of using the English language. Now, I don't mean to despair this. I know this is a very brilliant man. He's bilingual. He can also speak Mexican. But just two quotes. I could not. The first one comes from the second presidential debate in St. Louis on October 8th, 2004, in which he said, "The truth of that matter is, if you listen carefully, Saddam would still be in power if he were president of the United States, and we'd be a lot better off." It's hard to top that one, but just before that, when he was signing the Defense Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2005, he said, "Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we." I need to sit down fairly quickly. Before I do, he's run away. I want to introduce someone to you, someone who I understand has been newly elected to the library's foundation board. The Library Foundation is the group that is helping to bring author David McCullough to the library. I believe you saw that on the flyer when you came in, and we hope you might come for that. But also, in addition, and not incidentally, Vice Chancellor for Public Affairs at Vanderbilt University, Michael Schoenfeld.
Thanks, Bruce, and I'm not even going to attempt to follow that one, except to say, again, welcome to the Lunchbox series, welcome to the library, welcome to this fabulous and long-lasting partnership between the Nashville Public Library and Vanderbilt University. We are delighted to have you here today to eat, to listen, and we hope to discuss and challenge and provoke. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, to our interlocutor, David Wood, I just want to give a plug for a couple of coming events. One is next month's series, next month's installment of the Thinking Out of the Lunchbox series here at the library. It is Choosing Your Doctor, a Matter of Life and Death, and the speaker will be David Johnson, who is the Deputy Director of the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center and one of the most distinguished oncologists and cancer physicians in the world, a national and international leader in the study and the treatment of cancer. So we hope you will join us for that one in November. I also want to take a moment to highlight a very challenging and provocative program that is coming up at the Vanderbilt Great Performances on October 19th and 20th. It is the Great Tennessee Monkey Trial. It's a play by Peter Goodchild, and it will be performed by the LA Theater Works, which includes Ed Asner and James Cromwell, Marcia Mason, and many others. And it will be a debate over, or it'll be a reenactment, essentially, of the Scopes trial. And you can see it at the Vanderbilt Great Performances, which, due to construction, is being temporarily housed at the Curb Event Center at Belmont University. We're grateful to our friends at Belmont for allowing this to happen and permitting their fabulous new facility to be used for great performances. And you can, of course, get tickets online or get more information on the Vanderbilt website, www.vanderbilt.edu. So with those two plugs for coming attractions, I am very pleased to say that one of the great things about this series is the prescience with which my colleague David Wood manages to program speakers. And it seems like every time we gather at one of these events, the person who is speaking and the topic that is under consideration is front and center in the news, in the consciousness of the American public. And today is no different. Who would have thought that several months ago, when this series was being scheduled, that the whole issue of presidential leadership, of presidential power, of presidentialism would be a matter of great and grave national interest right now. Everything from the war in Iraq to the Supreme Court nominations to the debate, as if there should be one, about the role of the federal government in disasters. It's all converging today. It's all converging in these days and months. And to introduce our speaker today, our distinguished speaker today, to talk more about it from a very unique perspective is my colleague, our friend David Wood. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Bruce. I was a bit worried when Bruce was talking. I thought I heard the sound of black helicopters overhead. Welcome back. Oh, I do have one little extra announcement. Vanderbilt is also sponsoring another Wednesday lunchtime series, this time at the Frist, which will begin next Wednesday lunchtime and continues for the second Wednesday in November and the second Wednesday in December, which are talks connected with the Hudson River artists whose exhibition is currently on at the Frist, and you're all very welcome to come and join us there. I have to say there is no free lunch, but there is free talk and stimulation. We're very lucky today to have Dana Nelson to talk to us. Dana is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English and American and Southern Studies. Her teaching and research crosses back and forth across the boundary between American literature and history and thinking about democracy and race and gender. A recent graduate course she gave was on utopian economies, and she's currently teaching a course, I believe, entitled In Indianation, or Why White Men Like to Play Indian, from the Boston Tea Party to Dances with Wolves. And you can get a sense, I think, of her wonderful blend of creativity and scholarship from just a little bit of the blurb for this course. Why do white men like to play Indian? From rent protests to the Boston Tea Party, from volunteer firemen to the Fraternal Order of Red Men, from Boy Scouts to Deadheads, from Calvin Coolidge to Kevin Costner, from lacrosse to football and baseball mascots, white men have enjoyed playing Indian. She has a wonderful way about her, wonderful style, wonderful literary wit. Professor Nelson received her PhD from Michigan State in 1989, and after another of our successful raiding parties, she was headhunted by Vanderbilt from the University of Kentucky just last year. She's an extraordinarily active academic citizen with some 70 published articles and reviews and books which include National Manhood, Capitalist Citizenship and the Imagined Fraternity of White Men, The Word in Black and White, Reading Race in American Literature, 1638 to 1867, and more recently, Materializing Democracy, Towards a Revitalized Cultural Politics. Her next books will be on representative democracy and why presidentialism is bad for democracy. So you can see today's talk is drawn from her most recent writing and thinking. This topic, as Mike's already drawn our attention to, is really central to our public discussions in these troubled times, with poll ratings for the president at near all-time lows, with growing worries about corruption and cronyism in high office, with Katrina's exposure of a forgotten America of racial and economic deprivation, with an erosion of our standing in the wider world. It's all too tempting to blame the quality of our leadership. But if our desire to be led substitutes for active citizenship, it may be that betrays us, that we actually think we need someone else to help us rather than pursuing the possibilities of a really democratic society. And I think that's the sort of line that Dana is going to be taking today. Please welcome Professor Dana Nelson, one of Vanderbilt's newest and most sparkling minds, who will give us a peek into her current work on presidentialism and why it's bad for democracy. Dana.
I want to start by thanking you all for making time in your busy day to come to this. It's quite an honor to be invited to participate in this, and so I also want to say thank you to my university and to the Nashville Public Library for sponsoring this really interesting series. I've drawn today's talk from a book I'm currently working on. Forgot the glasses. This book outlines why I think presidentialism, can everyone hear me okay? Is this good? Okay. Why I think presidentialism, which is a word I'm using to describe the gravitational, symbolic, and institutional force of the presidency on U.S. understandings and practices of democracy, so why presidentialism has been counterproductive to democratic practice and expansion. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to outline some historical background about the invention of the presidential office, and then turn to a popular early fictional biography of George Washington to tease out some of my arguments about how the symbolic power of presidentialism trains citizens to turn away from, even to renounce, their democratic agency. Then I'll quickly conclude so there'll be plenty of time for question and answers. So Section 1, Inventing the Presidency. We lovingly remember the nation's first president, George Washington. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of our countrymen. We could do this together. This response is so automatic that it surprises most people to realize the nation did not have a president until 13 years after declaring independence. We habitually associate the Articles of Confederation with weak government, and discovering that it lacked an executive officer reinforces that picture. The Constitution, we know, was designed to remedy the flaws of the nation's original organization of government. It's worth pausing to rethink some of this historical shorthand. The 1780s is commonly represented in this account as a crisis moment in national history that necessitated the formulation of strong national government. This is an assessment, however, that the eminent historian Gordon Wood has described as incongruous. He says, this is a long quote, "On the surface at least, the American states appeared remarkably stable and prosperous. Both the Confederation government and the governments of the separate states had done much to stabilize the finances and economy of the country. The Confederation deficit could not be considered serious. Despite a temporary depression in the middle 80s, the period was marked by extraordinary economic growth. In fact, it was a period of high expectations, clearly reflected in the rapid rate of population growth," end quote. But the Constitution's advocates effectively harnessed the idea of crisis to a variety of concerns over emerging social diversity and democratic dissent. They used the notion of crisis as part of a political counteroffensive against what John Adams castigated as democratic despotism. local traditions and reconceptualizations of democratic practice increasing throughout the United States. During the years of the Revolution, citizens began insisting on participatory practices of representation and on more direct self-governance. This movement was expressed in a range of new practices: new strict residency requirements for representatives, expanded suffrage definitions framed to ensure structures for electoral consent, and a model of equally weighted electoral districts that reflected the one state, one vote rule of the Articles of Confederation. Citizens began showing up at legislative sessions to deliver instructions to their delegates, and some stopped sending delegates to state legislatures altogether, preferring to conduct their government closer to home. This growing prioritization of local democratic involvement, of face-to-face democracy, was amplified in the increasing phenomenon of extra-governmental organizations of the people in county assemblies, watchdog committees, radical associations, and out-of-door actions. We typically remember these self-organizations of citizens in Adams terms, as a threat to orderly government. This might sometimes have been true. But from another vantage, we can see people excited about and experimenting with new practices of participatory self-government. So I'm not suggesting here that government should be run by mob action, but I do want to remind us of this moment of excitement in the new nation, created by the imaginative power of the sovereign people. It is this democratic excitement, in fact, that the new office of the president was in part designed to calm. According to the authors of the Federalist Papers, the president would reflect a refined and rational version of what they described as the sense of the people. Electoral distance, carefully commissioned electors, term limitations, and the intermixture of powers all combined to provide a president who had risen above the personal passions and factional interests, who will preside democratically by transcending local investments and attending dispassionately to an abstracted national interest. Our democracy is unthinkable without this president, the most powerful man in the world, as we love to call him. But this idea was not immediately popular. In the late 1780s, the colonists continued to be suspicious of anything that smacked of monarchical power, eager themselves for the privileges and responsibilities of self-governance. And indeed, the executive branch might not have sold, except for the widespread assumption that General Washington would assume its duties. Washington's extraordinary reputation has managed to overshadow interesting debates about the executive office that developed during the convention itself. For instance, framers discussed having Congress elect the executive like a prime minister. They debated forming the office so that it would be shared by several people, a multiple executive. Supporters of this idea liked the idea of having men from different regions to balance the presidency's political representation across the differing interests of the country. The notion of the multiple executive lost, and maybe for good reason, but it's worth just pausing over the different resonances of these two very different conceptions of office. While a singular president could effectively symbolize and perhaps more effectively enact the unity and vigor and energy promised by the Federalists, the multiple executive would have symbolized something very different, modeling representative democracy as the process of negotiating plus some democratic disagreement. We should also take time to remember that even in the face of their admiration for George Washington, the framers did not give the executive the kinds of sweeping powers we associate with the office today. In the language of the United States Constitution, our president is not the leader of democracy. Quite differently, he is the executive of institutions that are designed to support representative democratic self-governance. He is, in the somewhat vague description of our founding document, a functionary of Republican governance, albeit with the strength of his own branch. For instance, the Constitution defines the president as our commander-in-chief. Most governmental historians agree that that title is a hollow formality. The term was not invented by the framers, but by King Charles of England in 1639, and was a title regularly granted to the British colonial governors in the North American colonies. The framers gave the legislative branch, not the executive, the power to fund and declare war, to call up the militia, to provide for the common defense, and other powers associated with national defense and wartime aggressions. Even the most ardent spokespersons on behalf of the Constitution and executive power, the authors of the Federalist Papers, were quite explicit that there was no intent to give war powers to the president. If we return to the Constitution, then, we can remember that the framers did not create a presidential government. What they created was a deliberative government that drew its power from the great body of the people, and the branch that represented that body, the Congress, was the branch that was vested with the most actual and symbolic power. Elaborating on the principle of separation and balance of powers, James Madison observed in Federalist 51 that in Republican government, the legislative branch necessarily predominates, end quote. The framers of the Constitution gave the executive almost no power that was independent of the legislative branch, the branch they aimed to represent the people. As political scientists Theodore Lowy and Benjamin Ginsburg framed the point, while the founders may have denominated the office holder as chief executive, the powers they gave him rendered him chief clerk. From very early in presidential history, since John Adams succeeded Washington, presidents and analysts alike have been debating how to negotiate the discrepancy between the scope of power seemingly signaled by the title for the office, the vigor and energy that the authors of the Federalist Papers attribute to it, and the constitutionally mandated dependence of the president on the legislative branch. In this continuing struggle, proponents of presidential power have managed to expand the purview of office, quite breathtakingly, I would say, by appealing to informal powers, powers that are staked to the symbolics of office. They argued that the president must have powers commensurate with his leadership role in representing a figure of national unity and strength. Presidential historian Richard Neustadt famously describes the tension between the form of presidential leadership and the fact of presidential clerkship, and argues that the best presidents obtain power not through their formal role, but through the influence that comes with the leadership form. Presidential power in this influential understanding flows less through the legal charter of the Constitution than through the symbolic dimensions of the office. Let's now turn to an example that will let us think about the cultural emergence of those symbolic dimensions and the kinds of power they authorize. Need a water break. Okay, so Section 2, Inventing Presidentialism. George Washington died in 1799, just as the national unity he was trying to represent as the nation's undisputed first president was breaking down into serious political disputes, including disagreements about whether people should be allowed to voice publicly their political disagreements and opposition. In 1789, John Adams and his Federalist colleagues pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts, which criminalized a range of public disagreements, and the Electoral College responded by electing Adams' opponent, Thomas Jefferson, to the office. This so-called Second American Revolution, the peaceful transfer of power from one proto-party to another, did not consolidate political unity in the United States, nor did it resolve anxieties about political disagreement among politicians or between the United States government and its citizens. So when the itinerant preacher and traveling book salesman Mason Locke Weems began marketing his wildly popular I Cannot Tell a Lie biography of George Washington in the early 1800s, he offered the American public a chance nostalgically and fictionally to recapture a sensation of national unity that could offset anxieties about ongoing political disunity. It seems that the American public in 1809 understood Weems's folksy fictions about the president for what they were, moral embellishments. It wasn't long, though, before moral fiction had turned into sacred national fact. Try telling a school kid that the I Cannot Tell a Lie story is a lie. Weems delivered to the nation a founding father with superhero qualities, one we are not willing to let go of. As Weems popularized this dead president, he started consolidating the symbolic force of presidentialism. Let's look at how Weems develops his symbolic president. If you haven't read this biography, it's a lot of fun to actually just go read it after years of hearing about it. This is where you can tell I'm an English professor. Recounting Washington's part in the defense of Fort Necessity during the French and Indian Wars, Weems describes a warrior with a magically armored body, and this is a long quotation. By this time, Braddock had fallen, his aides and officers to a man killed or wounded. Washington alone remained unhurt. Horse after horse had been killed under him. Showers of bullets had touched his locks or pierced his regimentals, but still protected by heaven, still supported by a strength not his own, he had continued to fly where his presence was most needed, sometimes animating his rangers, sometimes striving to rally the regulars. End quote. It's fun stuff. General Washington is magically shielded. He's impermeable. But the hard warrior who defends our country grew up from a boy with a miraculously soft heart. The childhood that Weems recounts is sprinkled liberally with Washington's tears, as for instance when one fall, his father chidingly reminds him of his selfish refusal to share an apple with his brothers and sisters the spring before. Then the father could only convince George to do so by promising that God would deliver a bigger apple harvest next fall in exchange for little Georgie's generosity. Confronted with the now loaded trees and his father's reminder, George looked in silence on the wild wilderness of fruit, then lifting his eyes, filled with shining moisture, he softly said, "Well, Pa, only forgive me this time and see if I ever be so stingy anymore." Washington's mythical status is such a commonplace, we don't often question the symbolic logic of such a story. What does it mean for Weems to create a president at once so impermeable and so sentimentally permeable, so hard and yet so soft? If, as I've suggested, the Federalists offered the president as an emblem of national unity that would replace the messiness of the routine disagreements fundamental to democratic engagement, Weems seems to be suggesting our first president can actually deliver the best of both desires for protection from engagement and for engagement. Weems's Washington can meet people's desires for protected patriotic unity and their desire for the risky emotional interconnections of living democracy. Weems's biography of Washington can help us think more about the loaded symbolics of presidentialism and examine more carefully how it begins converting democratic energies aimed at the public square into democratic feelings aimed at the symbolic or dead president. The chapter that recounts Washington's birth and education foregrounds little George's relation to his father, the grandfatherly Mr. Washington. Mr. Washington endeavors to give George a liberal education, teaching him to share with his friends, to labor always for generosity, and above all, to tell the truth. The famous cherry tree anecdote is only one episode in Mr. Washington's long lesson on truthfulness. Describing, and I'm going to give you the fun stuff, describing truthfulness to George as the loveliest quality of youth, Pa explains how he would ride 50 miles to see the little boy whose heart is so honest and lips so pure that we may depend on every word he says. By contrast, he offers up the case of the little boy who is so given to lying nobody can believe a word he says. Rather than see his dear George turn into this little boy, Mr. Washington describes how, "Gladly I would assist to nail you up in your little coffin and follow you to your little grave." Mr. Washington elaborates for a now tearful and anxious George, "I rejoice in the hope that you will never lie. At least you shall never from me have cause to be guilty of so shameful a thing. Many parents, indeed, even compel their children to this vile practice by barbarously beating them for every little fault. Hence, on the next offense, the terrified little creature slips out a lie just to escape the rod. But as to yourself, little George, you know I have always told you and now tell you again that whenever by accident you do anything wrong, which must often be the case since you are but a little boy yet, without experience or knowledge, You must never tell a falsehood to conceal it, but come bravely up, my son, like a little man, and tell me of it. And instead of beating you, George, I will but the more honor and love you for it, my dear. End quote. You won't nail him up in his coffin either, I hope. In this scene, Mr. Washington directs the desire for connection, in this instance, George's intense desires for his father's love, toward a disciplinary aim. Here his aim is explicitly truth-telling, but subsequent passages emphasize a subtle additional dimension to the lesson. The loving truths rewarded by male recognition, what Weems calls the spirit of a brother, lead to the right order of male self-subordination to a higher fatherly authority. This is a lesson little George successfully absorbs. For instance, in his school years, George's sentimental identification with fatherly authority led him quite often and shamelessly to tattle on and lecture his schoolmates for arguing amongst themselves. Weems offers a former classmate reminiscing about how George would upbraid his classmates. This is George. Angry or not, you shall never, boys, have my consent to a practice so shocking even in slaves and dogs. Then how utterly scandalous in little boys at school who ought to look at one another as brothers. And what must be the feelings of our tender parents when instead of seeing us coming home smiling and lovely as the joys of their heart, they see us creeping in like young blackguards with our heads bound up, black eyes and bloody clothes. And what is all this for? Why, that we may get praise. But the truth is, a quarrelsome boy was never sincerely praised. End quote. Now, George oddly invokes brotherly sentiment, fraternity, by appealing to the tender feelings not of brothers, but of parents. It is by this same logic that George rationalizes hauling in the master to cut off conflict rather than allowing boys to settle their disagreements amongst themselves. Weems's schoolboy George prefigures the work that presidentialism's sentimental logic will perform for the disorderly habits of democracy among adults. The president promises to circumvent the messiness entailed by equalitarian negotiation. He reminds boys citizens to preempt their own disagreements by subordinating themselves unquestioningly to the higher wisdom of their loving master or teacher or father or president, who always has their better interests at heart. Thus, symbolically, Weems's beloved dead president converts the self-governing equalitarian energies of political fraternity into loving desires for self-subordination within a hierarchically ordered fraternity in name only. George Washington's deathbed mourning for his father becomes a key emotional moment where Weems drives home the lesson of how to be a patriot. When Washington's father dies, we hear George's agonized cry, "Oh, my father, my father." Jarringly, Weems summarizes this painful moment in the following extraordinary way: the happiest youth, happy in that love to which thus an enamored soul strained an expiring aged sire. O worthiest to be the founder of a just and equal government, as lasting as thine own deathless name. End quote. This is a self-subordinating patriotism, a patriotism that clings for its guidance to the expiring father figure, like citizens should cling to the ideal dead president. The biography teaches Americans how to feel about their ideal president and their presidentially ordered federal system by encouraging them to model their own behavior on that of Washington. Explaining his narrative approach to biography, Weems insists that the private life is always the real life, that it is the life behind the curtain where one discovers the true worth of a patriot and a man. His biography monumentalizes Washington, who is most a patriot, in the privacy of his own home. Here, Weems teaches that citizens best exercise their citizenship not together in the public square, but at home in their individual remembrance of a dead president. For Weems, the aim is not to see your own political desires represented in deliberative governance, but to model your personal desires on those of an ideal representative. quote, "Since it is in the private virtues that lay the foundation of all human excellence, give us his private virtues. In these, every youth is interested, because in these, every youth can become a Washington." Weems insistently describes the public we, as in we the people, as the private I, thus relocating democracy's desires for a changed world to the presidentialism's self-disciplined and private heart. So, conclusion. It should be clear by now that I think presidentialism is bad for democracy. It's bad because it reroutes the radical practice of democracy, the hard work of achieving plus some democratic disagreement among the people, for a citizenry that learns from presidentialism to long for self-subordinating civic unity and national wholeness. It channels democratic energies into nominally democratic, civically and economically stratifying institutions where patriotic identification arrests questions about local, social, political, and economic injustice. It's this reverence for our dead first president that is instilled in school children, helping to condition civic expectations for that office and for our own democratic practice ever after. And I don't know about you, but when I was in school, my civic grade depended vitally upon how mannerly and quiet I was in class, not on how intelligently and carefully I questioned authority. We learn in childhood to cede our revolutionary grant of sovereign power as a self-governing democratic people to a fantasy about the president's boundless power, his superhuman ability to protect us, and his benevolence, his endless capacity to feel our pain, whether or not he can do anything about it. In a very real way, it's not particular presidents who are bad for U.S. democracy, and this is not to deny that some are better and some are worse. It's presidentialism that is the problem. Wanting the president to symbolize all we treasure about our nation, we make him both into the apogee and the guarantor of our representative system. But democracy, properly speaking, is our job. Insofar as we make it the president's, we participate in a fantasy that drains our democratic political imaginations, that lowers our tolerance for the necessity and practice of democratic disagreement, that keeps us from exercising our politicalness in fuller civic spaces. We could decide to spend less energy thinking about presidential culpability and even more about what we want out of democratic politics for the United States and the world. To put less energy into making the president a proper symbol for our democracy and more into reclaiming our role and expanding our work and agency within democracy nationally and internationally. This would be a project that would necessitate our learning not just how to posit, but negotiate substantive differences and disagreements in public. It would mean learning to ask much more complicated questions, questions that don't offer the moral ease of deciding whether our current president or presidential candidates or our new president on Tuesday nights, Gina Davis, are good or evil. We could use our democratic energy to work past presidentialism, electing, for instance, representatives who can think democratic power in terms that do not actualize when they sign it over to the president. We could stop wanting any president to represent our interests and begin imagining what it would mean if we were to do that work for ourselves. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dana. I mean, the project of this more horizontal democracy was actually behind setting up this series of talks and conversations in a small way. And this, where we are now, is at least part of the public square. That's the way I'd like to think about it. And we will get shortly to taking some questions from the floor, but before that I'm going to ask Dana just one or two questions of my own. In In 1995, former Senator Bill Bradley spoke to the Washington Press Club, and I'll just read you a few of the words he uttered at that time. He talked about the temptation offered by the knight in shining armor when the cover of a national magazine had General Colin Powell's picture on it, with a caption something like, "Will he be the answer to our problems?" If the problem, this is Bill Bradley still, is a deteriorating civic culture, then a charismatic leader, be he the president or a general, is not the answer. He or she might make us feel better momentarily, but then we are only spectators thrilled by the performance. How have we progressed collectively? And he goes on, a character, this is the bit I thought was interesting, a character in Bertolt Brecht's play Galileo says, "Pity the nation that has no heroes." To which Galileo responds, "Pity the nation that needs them." And I think you're expressing similar sentiments to Bill Bradley at that time, that presidentialism is a kind of childish delegation of the very responsibility that for democracy to flourish requires its citizens to exercise. And I'm reminded of discussions of the authoritarian personality about 50 years ago when academics were trying to come to terms with European fascism. And people's desire for strong leadership. And one hears today many people in strife-torn countries saying that above all they want the water and electricity to work. Freedom and maybe democracy can come later. Right now we want electricity. So I suppose the question some would put to you would be this: aren't there some circumstances, like a crisis, in which we need strong leadership? And isn't this the message of Katrina? And doesn't that throw the question back to having an effective president rather than to presidentialism as such? Who would not have wanted a Churchill at a time of war? And going back to Brecht's counterpoint between pity the nation that has no heroes and pity the nation that needs them, can we really write off the power of charismatic leadership more generally? Might it not be said that we're suffering from a political system that discourages the best people from running for high office? Again, I'm reminded of Yeats when he wrote that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Aren't we losing touch with what it might be like to have a genuinely smart, honest, compassionate, visionary man or woman leading the country? The politics of personal destruction makes it increasingly hard to find leaders with intact reputations in whom we might believe. And to drive this is going to be a question. To drive the point home, would you yourself, I mean, this is a sort of turning it back against you here, wouldn't you yourself not want to see as president somebody who could powerfully articulate the value of the kind of participatory democracy that you advocate? And oddly enough, Bill Bradley, who I'm not, this is not an argument for him, who was running at that time for president, carried on the speech that I was quoting from with the words, all of us have to go out in the public square and assume our citizenship responsibilities. So I suppose I'm saying, wouldn't we really want a president who would actually advocate the kind of participation that you're describing, in which case we do want the presidential power, we want it exercised in a different way? That's my first question.
I have at least 40 minutes worth of answers to that. How to say this? This is a project that's not advocating that we dump the president. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that when we're mad at the president, we should really re-examine our own relationship in that dynamic. Leaders can't lead without followers. I don't know, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm goofy, but I think the notion of the sovereignty of the people is one of the most powerful and potentially emancipatory ideas that we've invented in the modern age. And we've let go of the power of that within, 200 very short years. So we have people like Benjamin Ginsberg and Matthew Crenson writing about the downsizing of democracy and very pessimistically concluding that because the arena for civic action has diminished over the past 30, 40 years, and has been moved to the judiciary, that there's nothing regular citizens can really do about that except hope for, I don't know, some implosion of political leadership that will lead to a moment of change. And I think that is such a sadly pessimistic attitude. There is still power in the notion of people's sovereignty. The relationship between democracy, representative democracy, and national or local government has never been formulated effectively or pinned down. There's a lot of slippage in that. We're consenting to our civic downsizing, and that's not something we have to do. There's nobody that can make us not want to participate more, start participating more, putting our bodies and our ideas actively out there in a way that elected officials have to start paying attention to. Nobody tells us we have to stay home when something's happening that we don't like, and yet we do. And so I'm trying to get at what kinds of institutional and representational forms teach citizens to feel nervous about exercising that very amazing political grant. What teaches us to think that public political disagreement is something that's impolite and shouldn't be done? I mean, we all learned that, right? You shouldn't talk politics at the dinner table. It can upset people's digestion. Why does it upset our digestion? Why do we buy that? Why isn't it interesting to have those conversations with people who don't share our opinions? How have we let go of that basic fundamental entitlement to our own project of self-governance? And how do we get to the place where we believe there's nothing we can do about it? So that's part of what this project is trying to figure out. So I'm not saying dump the president. I'm saying reconfigure your relationship to him. Stop expecting him to save democracy. Start doing that work yourself. Talk to your work colleagues about politics and see what happens. And I don't think anything will really explode. So that's one. That's what you took a lot. I get a few minutes. So
you're going to get more time in a moment.
All right, I give up.
I'll just tell you that two other questions I would have, but I don't need you to answer them because we need to get some more interesting questions from other people. I mean, one question would be, where on earth do you think all this comes from? This patriarchal, I mean, are there sort of deeply embedded patriarchal structures that are just finding their way into our political life that have some other origin? You could see these also in various forms of religious belief and in family structures and power in families and so on. I mean, that's sort of one question of where all this is coming from. And then a sort of perhaps a more cute little comment. I mean, would you be happy for America to be more like Spain or Sweden or England, where you have a constitutional monarchy where the king or the queen actually has symbolic power, but almost no practical power? I mean, is that actually it'd kind of be weird if having got independence from Britain, we thought maybe they didn't have such a bad scheme after all. But I don't want you to answer these questions. I think it's time. It's time we asked you people for questions that Dana will just write down until she's got more than she can deal with, and then in the last few minutes we'll ask her just to respond to them. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes, a gentleman here.
I think you're actually more against an oligarchism as more of people taking care of us, just so complicated, folks, just trust us type of thing, But if you really did mean presidentialism, and you think of the disasters, except for those up there on Rushmore's cliffs, no one had a very decent second term. They're pretty much a disaster, and were jokes by the time their second term was gone, unless World War II was happening.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's really a danger. We'd so distrust our presidents after 4 or 5 years that I think we kind of just start laughing and getting bitter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question, gentleman over there, and then the lady in green.
I think a good case can be made, and indeed I think was made by David McCullough
Thank you.
In his book 1776, that without George Washington we would not have won the Revolutionary War. His charismatic leadership was important. This same case can be made that we wouldn't have won the Civil War without Lincoln. So a leader is apparently pretty important, as David has said, in crisis. Taking the other end of the string, the people seem to rise up and demand that alcoholic beverages be taken away from us. And then a few years later, the people rose up and said, no, we can have alcoholic beverages. So is not the utility of the charismatic presidentialism aspect an important thing?
Thank you. Yes, a couple of questions over here. And the lady in green.
Okay. You talked about this Williams fellow who wrote the bio of Washington.
Weems. Weems. W-E-E-M-S. Weems, yeah.
What?
His last name isn't Williams, it's
It
Weems.
wasn't Williams?
No, it's
Oh,
Weems.
from here it sounded like Williams.
Mason Locke Weems.
Okay. Well, whoever he was, you seemed to take him seriously, and yet it was very humorous the way you talked about what his Washington's rapport with his father. But it seemed to me to be such an exaggeration because the record shows that George Washington's father died when he was 8 years old, so he couldn't have had a whole lot of rapport with his father if he died when he was 8 years old. But it was interesting, and I just wondered how much weight you put on that fellow.
Weems.
Williams.
Okay, back there.
Yes, I was trying to think of some models in current day life, and I was wondering if the efforts throughout the state to bring back TennCare or to preserve TennCare with town hall meetings around the state of people getting together and protesting the cuts in TennCare, is that in the direction of what you're saying? Is that an example that would be more in the direction we need to go?
Okay, I've got two more questions this side. And
you were mentioning the sovereignty of the individual as being important in terms of the relationship of the sovereignty to the presidency. Well, in consideration of what is going on today and where the individual should be responsible to the presidency and in a certain way, speak to him and to what he does. When you consider the voting population of this country, we have 40% of the people in this country, from what I understand, that are actually voting, participating in the action of what is going to be done and who is going to be elected. How do we account for that in terms of establishing the responsibility of the individual to look toward their elected officials and select the right ones, so to speak?
Yeah.
Okay, we just have time for one more question, and then I'll ask Dana to respond.
I was wondering if you could comment on political organizing on the internet. In the last 10 years, with the rise of, on the right, nationalism as the only correct form of patriotism and presidentialism as the only correct form of patriotism, at the same time, I've seen a dramatic rise of populism on the internet. For example, Move On, the peace movement, popularity around Cindy Sheehan's rallies, and many other local movements, such as neighborhood listservs, where groups respond to locally a demolition of a house that was historic. And,
in Inglewood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that type of thing, I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Thanks. I'm afraid we're going to have to close this list for the time being.
This is such a rich and wonderful, can everybody hear me? This is such a rich and wonderful list of questions. I hardly know where to start. And I think what I'd like to do is start with the last one. I am really excited about what's happening on the internet. and more excited about some places than others. And I think there are good things and bad things happening. The bad stuff would have to do with the polarization of opinion, where people tend to log in, that their aim is not to deliberate, but really to have their own opinions reinforced. So they log into opinion pages that they know are going to confirm their beliefs. And what happens, as scholars like Cass Sunstein has shown, is that that tends to drive political opinion further and further apart. So people actually get more polemical as a result of reading self-confirming opinions, and it just tends to wedge the political spectrum further and further apart, making deliberation that much more difficult to accomplish. And it's the deliberation you can probably hear that I'm after. I'm this kind of zero-sum screaming head disagreement that we have on a lot of television talk shows. That's definitely, I don't think in anybody's book, an ideal for deliberative democracy, but that's just about all we have in public forums these days. So finding a way to get people comfortable with approaching people whose opinions are different and having reasoned, careful discussions is always a good thing. Part of what I like about what MoveOn is doing, and I don't like everything, but part of what I do like is their attempt to involve people in local face-to-face interactions. I think that's really important, because one of the trends that does distress me also in the internet examples is that our relationship to each other becomes more and more virtual, more and more protected by our own choices, so that we're not really doing any of the hard work that we all know actual democracy takes when you're having discussions with your family or your friends or your neighbors. That it's hard work, and if you don't get any practice at it, you're not going to learn how to do it. It seems that these days, and then this will go to the question about the gentleman that the gentleman raised about individual responsibility. These days, we're just asked to donate money. And, every time I get a request for money, I send them a letter saying, give me something to do. I'm tired of giving money. I want something to do. And I never get an answer back. So, at least MoveOn has given us something to do. But it's, how do we, for ourselves, instead of waiting for a charismatic leader, and I'd be happy to dump the notion of charismatic leadership, because I don't think responsible visionary leadership is necessarily the same as charismatic leadership. Charismatic leadership asks you to turn off your brain. Responsible visionary leadership asks you to stay engaged. So I'm looking for models that will remind us of our ability and even the joys of being engaged. And I'm not saying it's not difficult and painful and annoying and frustrating and slower. That's another one of the problems, right? Political scientists often want me to talk about the fact that it slows democracy down for more people to be involved. Government is lots more efficient if we'll just keep our noses down and stay out of things. And I just don't think that's really democracy. So I think we have a wonderful ability to be resourceful and solve these problems for ourselves if only we could remember that we're allowed to try. So to go to the question that was raised, I think David raised this, would I like us to be more like Spain or France or England? My quick answer to that is that I feel deeply optimistic about the United States democratic experiment. I am not giving up hope yet. And that's not to say that I don't have deeply partisan interests in all of these debates, but I think people together can really do interesting stuff. They can do some pretty heinous stuff too, and I want to keep trying here. The interesting thing to notice about systems like England and France and Spain, where there's a parliamentary system, is that they tend to have more political parties, which gives people more choice, and it also structures a symbolics that's not about zero-sum majoritarianism. So that one party, only one party can be in the presidency, and then everybody else has to just either put themselves patriotically as part of the presidential mandate for the man they didn't vote for, or grumble for 4 years about not feeling represented, right? If in a parliamentary system, that just works differently, and it tends to encourage more parties where people are more likely to get little bits of their political interest represented. It gives people more choices. So that's a kind of interesting thing to play with. There are all kinds of ways to build more choices into the possibilities that we have in our own system. And so we could explore those things if we were interested to do that. How much time? I think we're at time. Do you want me to?
2 more minutes.
Okay. So to answer The woman's question about my pressure on Weems's biography. Yeah, it's fictional and it's silly. I mean, and it's also very early 19th century. So, you know, you read it and you're reminded that our narrative conventions are quite different today. It was a wildly popular biography. It was taught in schools. It's sold and sold and sold well into the 20th century. It's still in print. So I'm not saying that it is in itself manufacturing these attitudes. What I am saying is that it powerfully harnesses and organizes some feelings and ideas people were starting to have, and it focuses them in a specific direction. And my argument is that its focus is anti-democratic. So insofar as we love that biography and we cling, you know, however playfully or happily to that notion of our president, General Washington, who was not the president of our country when he won the revolution for us, and wasn't the president until years later. Insofar as we cling to that, we're clinging to something that helps us feel anti-democratic, helps us feel that it's not a good idea for us to disagree with our friends, not a good idea for us to disagree in public, but that we should remember that, you know, however much we might dislike the president, it's a hard job and he has our best interests at heart. Why not just have our own interests at heart and work at representing those ourselves? That's that point, and I think I should stop. Thank you all so much for coming.
And I think I'd like to say that to Bruce, as if we have this Weems book in the library, could we put a health warning on it?
It's a good read. It's a fun book.
Thank you so much.
Oh, this was such fun.
I'm sorry, but the pacing, the way that's it's all right. Good to see you again. Yes, this was Oldport. I think his name was Old.